Hey friends, welcome back to English Conversation. In this series, we learn English through stories. Stories are one of the best ways to learn a language because they help us understand vocabulary, emotions, and ideas in a natural way. In today's episode, I will read a famous short story called The Bet. This story was written by the Russian writer Anton Chekhov. This story asks a very interesting question. What is more important in life, money or freedom? In this story, two men make a strange bet. One man believes that life in prison is worse than death. The other man believes that life is always better than death, even if a person must live alone. This story has a very powerful message. And while you listen, you will also learn new English words naturally through the story. If you enjoy learning English through stories like this, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with a friend who is learning English. All right, now let's begin the story. The story begins many years ago at a dinner party. A dinner party is a small event where people meet to eat food, talk, and share ideas. The dinner party took place in the house of a very rich man. This man was a banker. He was young at that time, and he was very proud of his success. He had a beautiful house, expensive furniture, and many guests. That evening, several intelligent people were visiting him. Among the guests were journalists, philosophers, professors, and a young lawyer. They were sitting around a large table after dinner. The candles were burning softly. Glasses of wine stood on the table. The guests were having a serious conversation. They were talking about crime and punishment. Punishment is something that happens when a person breaks the law. Someone mentioned the death penalty. Death penalty means that the government kills a criminal as punishment for a serious crime. Some people believe this punishment is necessary. Others believe it is cruel. The guests at the table had different opinions. One man said the death penalty is immoral. Immoral means something that is morally wrong. Another guest said, and quote, "No government has the right to take a human life," end quote. But the banker did not agree. He spoke strongly, and quote, "I believe the death penalty is more humane than life in prison," end quote. He said, humane means kind or compassionate. The guests looked surprised. One professor asked, and quote, "Why do you think that?" end quote. The banker explained, end quote, "Because death happens quickly," end quote. He said, and quote, "A person suffers only for a moment, but life in prison is slow suffering. Sitting alone in a prison cell for many years is worse than death." Some of the guests shook their heads. They did not agree. The young lawyer at the table suddenly spoke. He was only about 25 years old. His face was calm, but confident. "I do not agree with you," the lawyer said, and quote, "I believe that life is always better than death. Even if life is difficult, even if a person must live in prison, life still gives a person the chance to think, learn, and experience the world. As long as a person is alive," the lawyer said, "there is hope." The banker laughed loudly. "Hope," he said. "You think someone could live alone in a room for many years? That would be torture. Torture means extreme suffering." The lawyer looked serious. "I could do it," he said calmly. The banker raised his eyebrows. "You could live in isolation?" he asked. "Isolation means being completely alone. No people, no conversation." "Yes, I can do that," the lawyer said. "I believe life is worth living under any conditions." The banker suddenly became excited. He stood up from his chair. "Okay, let's make a bet." A bet is an agreement where people risk money or something valuable to prove who is right. The guests became interested. Someone asked, and quote, "What kind of bet?" end quote. The banker smiled and said, and quote, "I will give you $2 million if you can live alone for 15 years, end quote. The room suddenly became silent. $2 million was an enormous amount of money. Everyone looked at the young lawyer. The lawyer thought for a moment. Then he answered calmly, end quote, "I accept," end quote, he said. The guests were surprised. 15 years alone. It sounded impossible. But the lawyer continued speaking. He said, and quote, "I will stay alone for 15 years, in complete isolation. If I succeed, you will pay me $2 million, end quote." The banker laughed again. He said, and quote, "Done. 15 years, end quote." Then they shook hands. The bet had begun, but none of the guests at the dinner table knew how deeply this strange bet would change both men's lives. At midnight on November 14th, the bet officially began. The young lawyer entered the small house that stood in the banker's garden. The house had been prepared especially for this strange experiment. It was not large. Inside there was a simple bed, a table, a chair, a lamp, and shelves where books could be placed. There was also a simple piano in the room. The windows were covered so the lawyer could not see outside. The door was locked from the outside by the banker's servants. From that moment forward, the lawyer would live there completely alone. He would not see another human face. He would not hear another human voice. The only connection to the outside world was a small window in the wall. Through that window, the servants would pass him food, books, wine, or anything else he requested. If he wanted something, he could write a note and place it near the window. But no one would speak to him. No one would enter the room. The banker and the lawyer had agreed on very clear rules. If the lawyer left the room even a few minutes before the 15 years ended, he would lose the bet. He would receive nothing. But if he stayed for the full 15 years, the banker would give him $2 million. $2 million was an enormous fortune. The lawyer believed that 15 years of loneliness was a small price for such wealth. So the experiment began. The first year was the hardest. The silence was heavy and uncomfortable. When people are used to hearing voices, conversations, and the sounds of daily life, silence can feel frightening. In the beginning, the lawyer could not relax. He walked around the room again and again. Sometimes he sat at the table for hours thinking. During the evenings, he often played the piano. The music filled the empty room and made the silence less painful. Sometimes the servants in the garden could hear the piano late at night. The lawyer also asked for many books. But during the first year, the books he requested were not serious books. He asked for novels, light stories, and romantic books. These stories helped him escape his loneliness. Through books, he could imagine traveling to different countries. He could imagine meeting different people. He could imagine adventure, love, and excitement. Books became his companions. During the second year, something changed. The piano became silent. The lawyer stopped playing music. Instead, he began reading more seriously. He requested books about classical literature. These books were more complex and more thoughtful than the simple novels he had read before. The lawyer began to read slowly and carefully. He spent many hours studying. The silence of the house slowly became a place for deep thinking. Instead of fighting the silence, he began to use it. During the third and fourth years, the lawyer became a very serious reader. He read books about history, learning about different civilizations and ancient cultures. He read books about philosophy. Philosophy tries to answer questions like, what is the meaning of life? What is happening? What is truth? These ideas filled his mind. Sometimes he stayed awake all night reading. The lamp in the room burned late into the night as he turned page after page. The servants noticed that the lawyer requested hundreds of books. Boxes of books arrived regularly. The lawyer read them one after another. He seemed hungry for knowledge. During the fifth year, something unusual happened. The lawyer suddenly began requesting wine. He also asked for cigarettes. At first, he drank the wine frequently. The servants sometimes heard him walking quickly around the room. Sometimes he laughed loudly. Sometimes he seemed angry. Sometimes he slept for long hours. During the day, loneliness can affect the human mind in powerful ways. Without people, without conversation, a person can begin to feel unstable. The lawyer also began writing many pages. He wrote sentences. He studied day and night. Several years later, he wrote a letter to the banker. In the letter, he said something remarkable. He wrote that he had learned 6 different languages. To prove it, he wrote the same sentence in 6 languages. He asked the banker to show the letter to experts. If the experts said there were no mistakes, the banker should fire a gun in the garden. That sound would tell him he had succeeded. The banker followed the request. He showed the letter to specialists in languages. They examined the text carefully. Finally, they confirmed that the sentences were correct. The lawyer had indeed learned 6 languages. That night, the banker went into the garden and fired a gun into the air. Inside the small house, the lawyer heard the sound, and he knew his knowledge had been recognized. But the years were still passing. That was not finished. Many years remained, and during those days the lawyer would begin to change in ways that no one could imagine. As the years continued to pass, the lawyer's life inside the small house began to change in a very interesting way. At first, he had read novels and light stories. These books helped him escape the pain of loneliness. They filled his imagination with adventures, people, and emotions. But slowly his interest became deeper. He was no longer satisfied with simple stories. He wanted to understand. Knowledge. Knowledge means information, an understanding about the world. And so the lawyer began reading books about many different subjects. He studied history. He studied philosophy. He studied religion. He studied science. Day after day, year after year, the lawyer read. The small room that had once felt like a prison slowly became something different. It became a university. A university of books, a university of ideas. The silence that had once felt painful now helped him concentrate. Without noise, without conversation, without distraction, his mind could focus completely. The lawyer read with incredible intensity. To read with intensity means to read with strong concentration and passion. Sometimes he read all night. Around the 10th year of his isolation, something surprising happened. He started to focus on only one book, the Bible. For an entire year, the lawyer read almost nothing except this book. Day after day, he studied it carefully. He read it slowly. Sometimes he read the same passages again and again. The banker, who occasionally looked at the reports from the servants, found this strange. Why would someone spend an entire year reading only one book? But the lawyer seemed deeply interested. Perhaps he was searching for answers. He was searching for truth. Living alone for many years gives a person a lot of time to think about life. Questions about existence become stronger. Questions about purpose become more important. What is the purpose of life? Why do people suffer? What is happiness? What happens after death? These questions often appear when a person spends many hours in deep silence. After finishing his long study of the Bible, the lawyer once again changed his reading habits. Now he began reading everything. He ordered books in many different subjects again, but this time his reading was even more intense. Sometimes he read philosophy, sometimes he read science, sometimes he read poetry, sometimes he read religious books from different traditions. The servants noticed something unusual. The lawyer often changed subjects very quickly. One day he might read a book about chemistry. The next day he might read a novel. Then suddenly he might begin studying medicine. It seemed as if he wanted to learn everything that human beings had ever written. He read as if he were racing against time, page after page, book after book, year after year. The banker, who had grown older during those 15 years, sometimes thought about the strange bet. At the time of the bet, the banker had been young and proud. $2 million had seemed like a small risk, but now things were different. The banker was no longer as wealthy as he had been. Over the years, he had made many risky investments. Some of those investments had failed. His fortune had become smaller, much smaller. Now the thought of paying $2 million filled him with fear. If he paid that money, he might lose everything he had left. The banker began to feel anxious. At night, he sometimes woke up thinking about the bet. Only a few years remained. Soon the 15 years would end, and then the lawyer would come out of the small house, and the banker would have to pay him $2 million. The banker began to feel trapped by his own decision. 15 years earlier, the bet had seemed like a game. Now it felt like a terrible mistake. One night, the banker could not sleep. The wind outside was cold and strong. The garden was dark and silent. The banker sat in his study thinking about the bet. Only a few hours remained before the 15 years would be finished. Soon the lawyer would be free. Soon the banker would lose $2 million. Suddenly, a terrible idea entered the banker's mind. An idea so dark that he felt frightened by his own thoughts. He stood up slowly. His heart was beating fast. If the lawyer dies before the 15 years end, I will not have to pay. The thought shocked him, but it did not disappear. It remained in his mind. The banker walked slowly across the room. Could he really do something so terrible? Could he kill the man who had lived alone for 15 years? The banker felt ashamed of the idea, but fear and greed were fighting inside his heart. The banker looked toward the window. Outside the garden was completely dark. Somewhere in that darkness stood the small house. And inside that house, the lawyer was still alive, still reading, still waiting for the bet to end, still waiting for his freedom and for the $2 million. The banker slowly opened a safe in his room. Inside the safe was the key to the small house. He took the key. For a moment he hesitated, but then he made his choice. He put on his coat and quietly left the house. The night was cold. The wind moved through the trees. Step by step, the banker walked across the garden. He went toward the small house, toward the man who had lived alone for 15 years. But the banker did not know that inside the house something very interesting, something very surprising had already happened. The night was cold and dark. Every step felt heavy. 15 years earlier, he had made the bet as a joke, almost as a game. At that time, he had been rich, confident, and proud. But now everything had changed. He looked toward the small house at the end of the garden. Inside that house, the lawyer had lived alone for 15 years. 15 years without seeing people, 15 years without speaking to anyone, 15 years of silence. The banker suddenly felt a strange mixture of emotions. Fear, anger, shame, and something darker, greed. The banker whispered to himself, and quote, "If he dies before the midnight, I will not have to pay," end quote. The thought frightened him, but he continued walking. Step by step, he reached the small house. The door was locked. The banker carefully inserted the key into the lock. For a moment, he hesitated again. His hand trembled slightly. To tremble means to shake a little because of fear or nervousness. But finally, slowly, he turned the key. The door opened quietly. Inside the house, everything was silent. The banker walked through the small hallway. At the end of the hallway was the lawyer's room. For 15 years, that room had been the lawyer's entire world. The banker approached the door carefully. Through a small opening in the door, he could see inside the room. The lamp was burning softly. Books were everywhere. On the floor, on the table, on the shelves. The room looked like a small library. The banker looked more carefully. At the table sat the lawyer, or at least someone who looked like the lawyer, but the man had changed so much that he was almost unrecognizable. His hair was long and messy. His beard was thick and wild. His face looked pale and thin. He looked older than his age. In fact, he looked almost like an old man. 15 years of isolation had changed him greatly. The lawyer was sitting at the table with his head resting on his hand. In front of him lay an open book, but he was not reading. He was sleeping. The banker watched him silently. For a moment, he felt pity. Pity is the feeling of sadness for someone who is suffering. The banker thought, and quote, "This man gave 15 years of his life for money. Tomorrow he will receive $2 million. The banker quietly opened the door and entered the room. The lawyer did not wake up. He remained asleep at the table. The banker stood beside him. He could hear the lawyer's slow breathing. On the table next to the open book, the banker noticed something else. A piece of paper. It looked like a letter. The banker picked it up quietly. It was written in the lawyer's handwriting. The banker began to read. The letter began with these words: "Tomorrow at midnight, I will be free." The banker continued reading. "But before I leave this room, I want to say a few words to you." The letter was long and its message was shocking. The lawyer wrote that during the 15 years of isolation, he had read hundreds of books. Through books, he had experienced many different lives. He had traveled across the world in his imagination. He had climbed mountains. He had crossed oceans. He had studied science and philosophy. He had read the works of the great thinkers in human history. He had learned languages. He had explored religion. He had tried to understand the meaning of life through books. He had experienced thousands of years of human knowledge. The lawyer wrote that he had become wiser. He had learned that many things people chase in life are actually meaningless. Wealth, luxury, pleasure, fame, all of these things seemed small and unimportant after everything he had learned. He said that people live in illusions. An illusion is something that seems real, but is actually false. People believe that money will bring happiness. People believe that success will bring meaning to their lives. People believe that success will bring meaning to their lives. But the lawyer had discovered something different. After reading so many books and thinking so deeply about life, he had reached surprising conclusions. Human life itself was short and fragile. People fight. This meant he would lose the bet and the banker would not have to pay him anything. The banker finished reading the letter. He stood silently in the room. His hands trembled again, but this time it was not because of fear. It was because of shame. Deep shame. He looked at the sleeping lawyer, and subtly the banker understood something. The lawyer had become richer than him, not in money, but in wisdom, in freedom. The banker finished reading the letter. Slowly, for a long moment, he stood beside the sleeping lawyer without moving. The room was completely silent. The lamp on the table gave a soft yellow light. It illuminated the lawyer's thin skin and the many books around the room. Books were everywhere. It looked as if the lawyer had spent many long nights reading and studying. The banker looked again at the sleeping man. 15 years earlier, the lawyer had been young. He had been strong. He had been full of energy and ambition. Now the man sitting in front of him looked very different. He looked at the lawyer with new eyes. For the first time in many years, the banker felt small. Not physically small, but morally small. Morally means related to a person's sense of right and wrong. The lawyer, who had lived like a prisoner for 15 years, seemed stronger and wiser than the banker himself. The banker felt tears rising in his eyes. He leaned forward quietly. Then he did something unexpected. Very gently, he kissed the lawyer on the head. It was a silent gesture of respect. The banker then slowly walked out of the room. He closed the door quietly behind him. His mind was full of thoughts. Thoughts about life, thoughts about money, thoughts about the strange bet he had made 15 years earlier. When he returned to his large house, he could not sleep. He walked around the room slowly. He sat down. Then he stood up again. The banker thought about his own life. For many years, he had believed that money was the most important thing. He had worked hard to become rich. He had taken risks. He had made investments. He had chased wealth with determination. But what had it brought him? Anxiety, fear, worry. He had spent many nights awake thinking about money, thinking about losses, thinking about profits. But the lawyer had lived a completely different life during those 15 years. Inside a small room without luxury, without freedom, without comfort. And yet during those years, the lawyer had discovered something powerful. He had discovered that money did not control his happiness. He had discovered that knowledge could open doors inside the mind. He had discovered that wisdom could make a person free. The banker sat in his chair and covered his face with his hands. He felt embarrassed by his own greed, by his own fear, embarrassed by the terrible thought he had had earlier that night. Slowly the hours of the night passed. The banker did not sleep. He simply waited. He waited for midnight. He waited for the end of 15 years. Late that night, the banker looked at the clock. Only a few minutes remained before the bet would end. If the lawyer stayed inside the room until midnight, the banker would owe him $2 million. But if the lawyer left the room even a few minutes early, he would lose the bet. The banker remembered the lawyer's letter. He had promised to leave 5 minutes before midnight. The banker felt curious. Would the lawyer really do it? Would he really give up such a huge fortune? The banker waited quietly. Minutes passed slowly. Then suddenly something happened. The servant who was watching the small house in the garden came running to the banker's room. He was breathing heavily. The servant said, and quote, "Sir, the man in this small house has escaped," end quote. The banker jumped up. End quote. Escaped, end quote. He repeated, end quote. Yes, end quote, the servant said. He climbed out through the window and crossed the garden. The banker immediately ran outside. The cold night air surrounded him. He ran quickly toward the small house. When he arrived, he looked around. Carefully, he had broken the bet. He had refused the money. The banker stood silently in the dark garden. He felt relief, but he also felt something else. Deep respect for the man who had walked away from $2 million. The room felt strangely empty. 15 years of silence, 15 years of reading, 15 years of thinking, and now it was over. The banker walked slowly to the table. He picked up the letter again. He read it once more carefully. Every word felt heavy with meaning. The lawyer had written about the things he had learned during his years of isolation. People believe that money will bring happiness. People believe that success will make life meaningful. But the lawyer had discovered something deeper. He had rejected the money itself, and he had willingly lost the bet. So the lawyer had lost $2 million, but in another way, he had won something greater. Freedom. Freedom from money. Freedom from illusions. Freedom from the endless chase for wealth. The banker would never forget that lesson. The end.